Okay, so we are nearing the end of this podcast series on the history of the Christian right. This is episode 5, entitled The Culture Wars of the 1990s. Now, like I mentioned at the top of the podcast series, this is one of my favorite podcast series that I've done at the end of history because it's one of the first where I actually lived in the middle of the history that was being made. And this is that particular episode. I was coming of age in the 1990s. I think a lot of listeners out there, this is where they were kind of tracking their development. And these so-called culture wars between the left and the right played a big role in developing my worldview. I think a lot of listeners out there will recognize and recall some of the big historical moments that we talk about in this particular episode. Remember, if you have not yet purchased your copy of my new book, Politically Incorrect, Real Faith in an Era of Unreal Politics, please head to Amazon and get your copy today. If you're enjoying this podcast series, you're going to love that book. Chapters 2 and 3 recall a lot of these events specifically and a lot of the history that we covered in the course of this podcast series. It's a great stocking stuffer if you're looking for some final Christmas ideas for those believers out there who are interested and engaged with politics. You might want to get that for them. Anyway, that's at Amazon.com. Just search for J.B. Shreve, and that book should show up real quick. The final episode in this podcast series will post later this week. So outside of that, enjoy this, everyone.
This is the end of history.
A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies.
We believe that peace is at hand.
An axis of evil arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Democracy and freedom for all. We must choose in this crucial moment of human history.
So in the last episode, we saw how the moral majority, how they formed in 1979, and the foundations for what we know as the religious right today, they were laid primarily by Jerry Falwell. There were others, but it was primarily Jerry Falwell during that time period. So this was the beginning of a whole movement that would swell. It would really sweep across American politics, American Christianity for the next 3 decades. Few things in American political history are comparable. Really, few things are comparable to what the Christian right became and what they did over the next few decades in American politics. Whether they knew what they were doing or not when it happened, who knows? But as the influence of the Christian right grew, it surely seemed like this must be God. I mean, they were taking America back. They were reclaiming traditional values. And by the end of the 1980s, they had branded it as family values. And they were touting these over the liberal and elitist values that pushed for a breakdown of family and of tradition. It was a political revival. At least that's what it looked like from the inside looking out. Remember what I said in one of the earlier episodes of this series, though. The pendulum swings. The excess of one decade, be they liberal or traditional, they're frequently countered by the excesses of the next decade. And from a historical perspective, the 1980s and the rising dominance of the Christian or religious right was a counter to the radical liberalism or secularism of the 60s and 70s. And we've swung the other way once again since that time, now today. We'll get to that eventually. For now, the 1980s were the time of building a sort of religious, ideological, and political complex. You've got the old military-industrial complex that refers to geopolitics for the U.S. during the Cold War. Well, this was an ideological and political complex that the religious right was forming during the 1980s. The thinkers of the religious right rose up and established philosophy to counter the belief of former generations that said Christians should stay out of politics. Now, far from staying out of politics, getting neck deep in Christian politics was about as Christian a thing as you could do during the 80s. The Bible might say they will know you're Christians by your love for one another, but beginning in the 1980s, they would know we were Christians by our political beliefs and our loyalties. The moral majority was one of the biggest players on the block for the newborn Christian right, but they were by no means the only one. In the early years, several more organizations were birthed, and all of their efforts frequently converged together in the same causes and interests. Pat Robertson, he was son of a U.S. senator, a former televangelist himself. He started CBN, the Christian Broadcasting Network. So at the same time that Ted Turner was forming CNN, Pat Robertson was giving Christians a political voice and media outlet through CBN. Robert Grant started the Christian Voice. Ed McAteer, he started the Religious Roundtable Council. Dr. James Dobson started Focus on the Family. His organization would become a major player in the coming years as he provided Christians psychological resources and studies for everything from marriage to raising children. All of these worked together to become outlets for evangelical teaching and doctrine, and they converged in the Christian right's political activities throughout this decade. There were several different voices who laid the groundwork for the philosophy of the Christian right. These were the guys who laid out the biblically based framework to counter generations of belief that Christians shouldn't be involved in politics. Books like Render Unto Caesar by Charles Chaput, he explained how it was not only biblical for the mission of a Christian to be actively engaged with the state, even while they served God, but it was almost mandatory. One of the most influential thinkers and philosophers of the Christian right was Chuck Colson. His book, Kingdom in Conflict, he wrote a lot of books, but the book Kingdoms in Conflict, it really defined a rationale, a biblical basis for God-fearing Christians to be actively fighting for the purposes of God within the political arena. Now, Chuck Colson himself, he had been a key member of Richard Nixon's staff in the White House. He wasn't just a member of the staff, though. He was the hatchet man, all right? He would render Nixon's vengeance on political enemies during that time period. He was among the most feared men in the Nixon administration until the Watergate scandal erupted and sent him, Chuck Colson, to prison. In prison, Colson gave his life to God and became a devoted Christian. His book, Born Again, was the foundation for his own ministry that launched once he completed his prison sentence, and he was one of the most influential voices in the Christian right until his death in 2012.
I was a driven guy. I had grown up in the Depression years where I saw neighbors standing in bread lines. I was going to get to the top no matter what, because I wasn't going to ever be caught in the position that I saw my parents in. I won't say I didn't have a conscience, I did. I had almost a self-righteousness about me. Self-righteousness is the worst enemy of all because you can't see your own sins. I ended up going to prison because of that.
I have committed my life to Jesus Christ. I can work for the Lord in prison or out of prison. That's how I want to spend my life.
I discovered they're all like I am. I suddenly realized I'm not any different than these guys. I'm not any better than these guys. I committed a crime too. Mine was, nobody got killed, but we both prisoners. We had that common. I want to stop crime, but I want to stop it by the only way it'll ever be stopped, and that's changing the human heart.
The problem is not education, the problem is not poverty, the problem is not race, the problem is the breakdown of moral values in American life.
Exactly right.
And the criminal justice system can't respond. I came to love men, I came to know them as brothers, men that before in my life I'd have gone to any lengths to avoid meeting or being with. But above all, I saw the miracle of how God works in the life of man.
So when President Reagan entered the White House in 1980, his election victory, it was the first real showing of strength for the Christian right. Now, like I said in the last episode, the Christian right didn't get Ronald Reagan elected, but they played a really big part in that. And Ronald Reagan knew that. Now, he's an interesting figure in the story of the religious right. On the one hand, there's the image and impression of Ronald Reagan, and then on the other hand, there's the reality. The reality is that Ronald Reagan wasn't really a very religious person at all. That fact flies in the face of a lot of what we know and believe today. Some of the listeners out there, they might find it even debatable. Historically, though, some writers have even said, they've gone so far as to say that Ronald Reagan was one of the least religious presidents that we've had in modern history. He rarely went to church as president. And he explained that. He said his presence at church would be too big a distraction for the other people there who were worshiping. He never talked about a salvation experience like Jimmy Carter had done. His wife, Nancy, regularly used an astrologer in the place of where most people would have claimed to go to like a faith leader, a pastor or a religious leader. Reagan had advisors who were Christians, but we just don't see a lot of historical facts that support a belief that he himself was a strong Christian believer. Now, the reason that might be a contentious statement when I say it isn't because of the facts, but because of the impression. Ronald Reagan, he put across this impression while he was a president and even afterward. The thing that Ronald Reagan was more than anything else was really the master communicator. He could present the image that the people wanted to see. When you look back on his life as a public speaker, as an actor, as a political leader, there was always in that area, it was always in that area as a communicator where he stood out. He didn't come across as an intellectual or even as a politician most of the time. He came across as this honest, sincere, and devoted person at a really deep level. And that was what made his speeches powerful and why so many remember his presidency so fondly even today. So as the religious right rose to prominence, it was only natural that the great communicator, Ronald Reagan, he would learn to speak their language and establish that gift of communication with them. So when we hear him speak about faith and religion when he was president, we've got to remember that. He was a master communicator, even if he really wasn't a devoted Christian himself.
Someone asked me whether I was aware of all the people out there who were praying for the president. And I had to say, yes, I am. I felt it. I believe in intercessionary prayer. But I couldn't help but say to that questioner after, sometimes when he was praying, he got a busy signal. It was just me in there ahead of him. I think I understand how Abraham Lincoln felt when he said, I have been driven many times to my knees by the overwhelming conviction that I had nowhere else to go. Now, I realize it's fashionable in some circles to believe that no one in government should encourage others to read the Bible. That we're told that we'll violate the constitutional separation of church and state established by the Founding Fathers in the First Amendment. The First Amendment was not written to protect people and their laws from religious values. It was written to protect those values from government tyranny. I've said that we must be cautious in claiming God is on our side. I think the real question we must answer is, are we on his side? No matter where we live, we have a promise that can make all the difference. A promise from Jesus to soothe our sorrows, heal our hearts, and drive away our fears. He promised there will never be a dark night that does not end. Our weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning. He promised if our hearts are true, his love will be as sure as sunlight. And by dying for us, Jesus showed how far our love should be ready to go. All the way. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. We all can. Americans yearn to explore life's deepest truths, and to say their entertainment, or their idea of entertainment, is sex and violence and crime, is an insult to their goodness and intelligence. We are people who believe love can triumph over hate, creativity over destruction, and hope over despair. And that's why so many millions hunger for God's good news. I've always believed that we were, each of us, put here for a reason, that there is a plan, somehow a divine plan for all of us. I know now that whatever days are left to me belong to him. I also believe this blessed land was set apart in a very special way. Our forebears came not for gold, but mainly in search of God and the freedom to worship in their own way. We've been a free people living under the law with faith in our Maker and in our future. I've said before that the most sublime picture in American history is of George Washington on his knees in the snow at Valley Forge. That image personifies a people who know that it's not enough to depend on our own courage and goodness. We must also seek help from God, our Father and Preserver. We'll never find every answer, solve every problem, or heal every wound, But we can do a lot if we walk together down that one path that we know provides real hope. The morality and values such faith implies are deeply embedded in our national character. Our country embraces those principles by design, and we abandon them at our peril. My experience in this office I hold has only deepened a belief I've held for many years. Within the covers of that single book are all the answers to all the problems that face us today if we'd only read and believe.
The religious right was rising in prominence throughout President Reagan's term, and he was mastering his communication style with this group, really becoming a hero for many of them. But you've got to keep in mind that most of the political goals of the religious right during this time period weren't really getting anywhere. Abortion wasn't overturned. Prayer wasn't reinstituted in the schools like they wanted. Sex ed wasn't kept out of school. Pornography wasn't outlawed. The Christian right was gaining ground in the realm of political influence to get their candidates, their messages, and their voice heard, but the policies weren't changing all that much. This was true under Reagan, and it would be true in the 90s under Bill Clinton. So although laws weren't changing, there is credible evidence that society was changing. Now, this might have been because of the Christian right, or maybe it was that swinging pendulum that I've talked about earlier, but things did start to shift in the 80s. Society began growing more conservative. There may not have been any laws stopping abortion, but as the Christian right began protesting and broadcasting what was going on with abortion, the number of abortions taking place in America slowly began to decrease. People began to seek out a more traditional, a more conservative, and in some ways even a more Christian way of life. So I guess in that way, the Christian right was kind of winning by the end of the 1980s. The biggest headway that the Christian right made in the realm of politics was in the ways of influence among the candidates. It wasn't just presidential candidates. Senators and congressmen realized they had to contend with the religious right. They were either for them or against them. If they were for them, then they had to learn to talk their language. More and more political representatives, they began to talk the language of the religious right. President Reagan, of course, was the first to master that skill. This right here, this is a clip from President Reagan speaking to the Christian right at an event known as the National Affairs Briefing while he was president.
You know, a few days ago, I addressed a group in Chicago and received their endorsement for my candidacy. Now, I know this is a nonpartisan gathering, and so I know that you can't endorse me, but I only brought that up because I want you to know that I endorse you and what you are doing.
The selection of cabinet appointments, judges, and policy priorities, they began to be something that the Christian right started to have really heavy influence in promoting around this time. And as America regained prominence under Ronald Reagan, and as the Soviet Union and communism began to fade throughout the world, it wasn't just escaping anyone's attention among the Christian right that a lot of this was happening once Christians got more heavily involved in the political affairs of the country. Well, it wasn't long before many other Christians, and many among the Christian right, came to the conclusion, why should they simply support candidates who embrace their values and their causes for the positions of the moral majority? What was to keep Christians themselves from running for office? And so the Congress and the Senate, it slowly began to be populated with evangelical candidates and representatives who held fast to the dogma of the Christian right. They weren't making up a majority, but they were slowly beginning to fill more and more seats in the Congress. In 1988, Pat Robertson of CBN, he even ran for president.
There was when he ran a television ministry. He often referred to the miracles that he had performed with the help of the Lord. But since becoming a Republican presidential candidate, Robertson seldom refers to that part of his life. As NBC's Lisa Myers reports now, Robertson gave up his title as the Reverend to run for president, and he has come up with a new billing.
For God and country.
Thank you. God bless
Pat Robertson today for God and country.
Marion Pat Robertson is an evangelical Christian who would be president.
The storm, in a sense, broke off.
He believes his prayers diverted a hurricane, that was God's sign he should run for president.
And it was a miracle.
Praise God Almighty.
Hallelujah.
Robertson believes that God speaks through him on many matters, including miraculous healings.
There's a woman here with cancer of the womb, and I don't think it's been diagnosed. You didn't know what it was. It's been excessive bleeding, and God has healed that right now tonight. It's healed. Thank you, Lord.
But now, just 3 months after trading the title Reverend for candidate, Robertson is trying to blur his religious past. He denies ever being an evangelist.
I've never been an evangelist in my life. I'm the head of the 5th largest cable network in America.
He emphasizes the secular in campaign commercials.
Only one candidate running for president has built a small business into a major national corporation.
That business is the Christian Broadcasting Network, CBN, where for almost 20 years he hosted the 700 Club, preaching to millions of fundamentalist Christians about everything from saving souls to the end of the world.
Pat Robertson takes an in-depth look at earth-shaking biblical prophecies being fulfilled right now. Startling events foreshadowing the end of the world as we know it.
This is Jerry Straub. He's from...
Gerard Straub, a former CBN executive, says that at a prayer meeting he taped in 1980, Robertson prophesied that those startling events could begin in 1982.
And he came in and outlined what he believed God was telling him was in store for the world.
The hour of his wrath has come. Now, if I'm hearing him right, things are starting to happen. All we know for sure is that the U.S. is going to stand against Russia, and that Russia's going down. We don't know if it'll be nuclear. It could be. It doesn't have to be. It could be. But there could be some big boom boom all around going on when this thing starts.
There was a literal time that this was going to happen. In fact, at CBN, we were actively engaged in planning to televise the second coming of Jesus.
Pat Robertson gives you insights to events.
Robertson believes the second coming of Jesus will follow this ultimate Holocaust. Some, including the pastor of the church to which Robertson belongs, fear that his apocalyptic religious beliefs could affect President Robertson's foreign policy decisions.
In practical terms, it might mean if the world is going to come to a catastrophic end anyway, what is to prevent me from pushing the button?
Some also worry that Robertson's religious beliefs could affect civil rights. In his book called Answers, Robertson notes that in the Old Testament, homosexuals were executed. He says the New Testament tells us they shall receive in their own bodies the punishment for their actions. Robertson on women.
The woman is supposed to be in subjection to her husband. The husband
and on non-believers.
Individual Christians are the only ones really, and Jewish people are the only ones that are qualified.
Obviously, you're not saying that there are no other people qualified to be in government or whatever if they aren't Christians or Jews. What you're saying is
I'm
that...
saying that. I just said it. I believe it.
When questioned, Robertson says despite such beliefs and statements, as president, he would seek peace and uphold the law. Still, for candidate Robertson, the past is likely to remain a dogged companion. Lisa Myers, NBC News, New York.
Of course, Pat Robertson, he lost the presidency, but that didn't mean that the Christian right lost any of their influence. The man who beat him, the first President Bush, he chose for his vice president running mate a guy who barely anyone had ever heard of. Dan Quayle. He wasn't a major political figure, but he was a bona fide member of the religious right. Shortly after becoming vice president, he seemed to start a war of words with the television sitcom Murphy Brown at that time. And he said that this sitcom, Murphy Brown, was glorifying single motherhood and eroding family values. So after that, this war of words, the phrase family values, became a standard code word for the religious right, and that was where that's where it originated from. There in that battle between Dan Quayle and the Murphy Brown sitcom. Bush would lose his efforts for a second term in '92, and he and Dan Quayle were both out of the White House, replaced by the new president, Bill Clinton. So the campaign of '92 is often seen as the start of the culture wars in America. The Republican convention featured some of the harshest language, some of the harshest attacks yet from the religious right against the Democratic liberals. The most prominent speech was the speech from Pat Buchanan. Now, the speech itself is known as the culture war speech.
The presidency, my friends, the presidency is also an office that Theodore Roosevelt called America's bully pulpit. Harry Truman said it was preeminently a place of moral leadership. George Bush is a defender of right to life and a champion of the Judeo-Christian values and beliefs upon which America was founded. Mr. Clinton, however, has a different agenda. At its top is unrestricted abortion on demand. When the Irish Catholic governor of Pennsylvania, Robert Casey, asked to say a few words on behalf of the 25 million unborn children destroyed since Roe v. Wade, Bob Casey was told there was no room for him at the podium at Bill Clinton's convention and no room at the inn. Yet a militant leader of the homosexual rights movement could rise at that same convention and say, Bill Clinton and Al Gore represent the most pro-lesbian and pro-gay ticket in history, and so they do. Bill Clinton says he supports school choice, but only for state-run schools. Parents who send their children to Christian schools or private schools or Jewish schools or Catholic schools need not apply. Elect me, and you get two for the price of one, Mr. Clinton says of his lawyer spouse. And what? And what does Hillary believe? Well, Hillary believes that 12-year-olds should have the right to sue their parents. And Hillary has compared marriage and the family as institutions to slavery and life on an Indian reservation. Well, speak for yourself, Hillary. Friends, this, my friends, this is radical feminism, the agenda that Clinton and Clinton would impose on America. Abortion on demand, a litmus test for the Supreme Court, homosexual rights, discrimination against religious schools, women in combat units. That's change, all right, but that's not the kind of change America needs. It's not the kind of change America wants, and it's not the kind of change we can abide in a nation we still call God's country.
So as we entered the 1990s, the religious right seemed to be at its apex of power. It had a wide-ranging and influential network of media outlets and commentators. It had representatives in both houses of the Congress. It had a well-established ideology and philosophy machine. And the religious and political landscapes were dotted with organizations that represented the interests of the religious right in all sorts of different lines. But a battle was brewing in the form of the culture wars. The religious right looked at the time poised to win that battle. So as we turn to our final episode in this series, which will release tomorrow, the next episode, it's going to look at the decline of the religious right and consider if that party, the religious right, if the party's over, and if this is really the end of the religious right, what we're seeing today happen in 2016. And if that is the end, how did we get there and what happened?
Listening to The End of History with J.B. Shreve.
Check out more episodes at iTunes and wherever you download quality podcasts. Join us online at theendofhistory.net for articles and essays from the end of history. Follow JB on Twitter at JB_Shreve. The End of History is produced by Windmill